I laughed at him once, openly in front of everyone. He didn't flinch, he didn't move, he just looked at me, the way you look at something you have already decided to keep. I didn't understand that then. I understand it now. Eleanor, Marchioness of Blackwood. The storm came at night. Eleanor was awake when it arrived. She was always awake when the storms arrived, because Blackwood Manor on the edge of the Cornish cliffs did not shelter storms, did not contain them, did not reduce them to anything manageable. They arrived complete, without useful warning, driving against the windows with the conviction of something that had crossed the Atlantic for the sole purpose of reaching this house. She sat up in bed and listened. The wind on the cliffs, the sea below, invisible in the darkness but present in everything, in the smell of salt and in the low frequency she felt in her bones before she heard it with her ears, the old timber of the house flexing and answering like something alive, and somewhere below footsteps. She recognized them without needing context. 3 years in Blackwood Manor had mapped the sounds of him into her without permission. The heavier step on the third board of the east corridor, the pause before opening the study door, the particular quality of silence he created in any room he occupied. Arthur Sterling, Marquis of Blackwood. She had laughed at him once, in front of 200 people, in a ballroom blazing with candlelight within earshot of everyone who mattered in London society. She had looked at the man standing at the entrance to Ashbourne House, dressed in unrelenting black, without ornament, without a single concession to fashion or occasion, and she had said something that made Charlotte double over beside her. He heard. He stood with his eyes on her for 3 seconds that she had never quite managed to forget, and then he left. She understood months later that he had not been wounded by the remark. He had, on the contrary, been confirmed. The storm struck the window with renewed force, and Eleanor pulled her knees to her chest and listened to his footsteps move through the corridor below, and thought about London, and about darkness, and about cliffs, and about the distance between what she had been and what she was now. The distance was enormous. She would not have traded any part of it. The Ashbourne Ball was the event of the autumn season. Eleanor knew this because her mother had said so approximately 12 times in the preceding fortnight, in the tone reserved for facts she considered self-evident and therefore in constant need of reinforcement. The Ashbourne Ball. The most important evening. The room where reputations were confirmed or quietly demolished. Eleanor had smiled and agreed and privately thought that spending a Tuesday evening being everything one had been raised to be was an exhausting way to enjoy oneself. She was 20 years old, the daughter of the Earl of Stratford, title, connections, enough money to be taken seriously, not so much that no one tried to manage her. She was clever in the way society tolerated, sufficiently witty to be entertaining, never enough to be threatening. She had learned very early that the world rewarded legibility, being exactly what one appeared to be, no more and no less, within the limits others had established in one's absence. She was, by every measure that mattered in 1814, exactly what she was supposed to be. She arrived at Ashbourne House at 9:30, late enough to be fashionable, early enough to observe the room before it reached full density. Her mother was beside her, already performing the particular lateral sweep of a woman cataloguing who was present and what it meant. Her father had gone ahead and was somewhere near the card room, which was where her father always went. The ballroom was everything the autumn season required. 200 candles in chandeliers, casting warm gold across the assembled faces of London society in its finest. The musicians in full force, the smell of hothouse roses and powder, and the particular warmth of a room full of people performing for one another. Charlotte appeared at her side before she had taken 10 steps. "Lady Pemberton is furious with her youngest," Charlotte said without preamble, with the satisfaction of someone who had been carrying interesting information long enough to appreciate its delivery. "She refused Lord Alcott last week, and now the mother is attempting to repair the damage by smiling harder than anyone should." "Will it work?" Eleanor asked. "Probably not, but one has to respect the effort." They moved through the ballroom with the ease of two people who knew the terrain completely, greeting here, smiling there, the small social map of a room like this executed without thought. Eleanor smiled at the right people. Charlotte steered the conversation away from the wrong ones, the invisible work of a well-navigated evening. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The reading of rooms, the management of entrances and conversations, the particular art of being present without being exposed. She did it the way she breathed, automatically, without effort, without thinking about what it cost. It cost something. She had simply stopped noticing the cost a long time ago. And then Charlotte stopped. "Eleanor," she said in a low voice, not alarm, something closer to astonished curiosity. "Who on earth is that?" Eleanor followed her gaze. He stood at the entrance to the ballroom, at the top of the entrance steps, in the moment before a butler would normally have announced him, in that instant of arrival not yet processed by the room. Tall, dark-haired, completely still in the way that some men were still, not the stillness of uncertainty, but the absolute practiced stillness of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space he needed, and no more. And the clothes. The clothes were impossible not to notice, not because they were poorly made. They were perfectly well constructed, clearly expensive fabric cut with precision, but they were entirely, completely, without a single concession to the occasion, unrelenting black, no ornament, none of the embroidered waistcoats or gold buttons or decorative details that every other man present wore as social language. Mourning clothes or something so severe as to be indistinguishable from them, in a room where every person present had dressed to shine. There was something else she noticed underneath the clothes, the way he stood in them, not with the discomfort of a man who had dressed incorrectly and knew it, with complete indifference to the question, as though the room's opinion of his appearance had not occurred to him as a relevant variable, and, were it to occur to him, would remain irrelevant. She had never seen that before. Not here. In these rooms, everyone was always aware of how they appeared. The awareness was the baseline, the condition of entry. Even the people who appeared not to care about it cared about appearing not to care. This man simply didn't. It was entirely different. He looked at the room without apology, without the performance of ease that men produced when they found themselves somewhere they might not belong. He simply looked, with the complete, unhurried quality of someone assessing a terrain he had already decided to cross. "He looks like a gravedigger who took a wrong turn," Eleanor said. She had intended it as a light observation, the kind of comment that dissolved into laughter between friends and was forgotten before midnight, the kind she made a dozen times an evening without thinking, because the world was full of things worth noticing, and she noticed most of them and said half of what she noticed, and that had always seemed like reasonable restraint. Charlotte laughed, not quietly. "A crow," Charlotte said through the laughter. "A crow that wandered into a garden party." The remark had arrived before caution, and it was not the discreet laughter of two people with adequate subtlety. It was the kind that opened space around itself, that made heads turn in a small radius. Eleanor was already composing the next observation. Something about the severity of the collar, perhaps, or the complete absence of any attempt at a fashionable cravat, when she felt it. Not a sound, not a word. A shift in the quality of his stillness, almost imperceptible, the way temperature shifted in a room when a window opened somewhere else in the house. A change you felt before you located its source. She turned her head. He was looking directly at her, not at the room, not in her general direction, at her specifically, with the precision of someone who had identified the exact source of a sound and turned toward it with complete accuracy. His eyes were dark, dark enough that she couldn't read their color at this distance, only their quality, the absolute steadiness of them. No offense, no flush, no wounded pride, none of the responses a man was supposed to produce when a woman laughed at him within earshot of half a London ballroom. Just attention. The complete, unhurried, low-temperature attention of someone who had just seen something they intended to understand. Not to punish, not to manage, to understand. It was more unsettling than anger would have been. 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Then he inclined his head, small, precise, the minimal acknowledgement of a man who had registered something and chosen how to respond to it, and returned his gaze to the room. He descended the entrance steps without hurry, crossed the floor without looking to either side, without accepting anything from the passing trays, without acknowledging anyone who turned to watch him pass. At the far doors leading to the terrace he paused, one moment not looking back, and walked through them and was gone. The room filled the space he had left, and moved on, the way rooms did. Charlotte was still recovering from the laughter. "Extraordinary. Who do you suppose he is?" "Nobody important," Eleanor said. She believed it then. She would remember saying it later, would turn it over many times in many different lights, and marvel at how completely, specifically, precisely wrong it was. The evening continued. She danced twice, once with Lord Fairweather, who was pleasant and said nothing she remembered, and once with a younger son of someone she couldn't place whose name she forgot before the final chord. She spoke to the right people. She laughed at the right moments. She said the right things to Lady Pemberton about her youngest daughter, which were not true but were kind, which was usually sufficient. She did all of it with the smooth automatic competence of a woman who had been doing this since she was 17. And the whole time, underneath all of it, with the persistence of something that had lodged in an inconvenient place, 3 seconds. She kept returning to them without intending to. Mid-conversation, she would find herself back at the moment of his turning, the quality of that attention landing on her face. She would redirect herself, focus on the person speaking, on the glass in her hand, on the particular social task of the next 5 minutes, and then drift back again. It bothered her. The bothering bothered her. She was not accustomed to being bothered by things she couldn't name. She could usually name things. It was one of the capacities she was quietly proud of. The ability to locate the center of a situation quickly, to say, "This is what this is." To file it correctly and move on. She could not file this correctly. "Nobody important," she had said. Then why were the 3 seconds still there? The carriage home was warm and close-curtained. London outside reduced to a muffled, continuous presence. Her mother talked about who had been at the ball and what they had worn, and whether Lady Carlisle's new diamond parure was genuine or paste, which was a question that could apparently sustain considerable analysis. Eleanor sat across from her with her hands folded and made the sounds of a person who was listening. She was not listening. She was in the entrance of Ashbourne House, the top of the steps, the black clothes and the complete indifference to the room's assessment of them. The way he had stood there, not performing, not managing his arrival, simply arriving. He heard me, she thought. She was certain of it in the way you were certain of things you couldn't prove. He heard every word. And then he had looked at her with those steady dark eyes for 3 seconds and inclined his head, as though acknowledging a point, she thought. Not conceding it, acknowledging it. The minimal gesture of a man who had registered something and decided it was worth a response and chose the smallest possible response available. What did that mean? Most men in that situation, laughed at in public, in a ballroom full of London society, would have produced one of 2 responses: anger, hot, or cold, or the aggressive performance of not caring, which was its own kind of caring, visible from across the room. He had produced neither. He had looked at her as though she were a puzzle piece that had just settled into a position he had been watching for. "Eleanor," her mother said. She looked up. "I asked whether you thought the Pemberton girl will manage an acceptable offer before the season ends." "I think," Eleanor said, "that she'll be fine." Her mother accepted this and moved on to the paste diamond question, and Eleanor returned to the carriage window and told herself firmly that the whole thing was nothing. The discomfort of a small unkindness, no more than that, the kind she had committed and forgotten 100 times before, and that by tomorrow morning she would have forgotten his face entirely. Home at midnight, her maid waiting, the familiar ritual of unpinning and unlacing, the comfortable return of the house closing around her after the performance of the evening. She dismissed her maid earlier than usual, sat at the small writing desk near the window in her nightgown, with a candle burning low and the London night pressing quietly against the glass. She picked up her pen, put it down. Nobody important. The thing about saying something with that kind of absolute certainty was that the certainty was often the first sign that the thing was not true. Certainty, the firm, closing kind, was what you reached for when something was trying to stay open. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and looked at the candle flame and made herself be still. He had heard her laugh at him and looked at her for 3 seconds and inclined his head and walked away. That was what had happened. Those were the facts. There was no reason for 3 seconds of eye contact across a ballroom to occupy any further space in her mind. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle. The 3 seconds stayed. She told the ceiling, "It doesn't matter. I will never see him again." And the ceiling said nothing, as it always did. And she pressed her lips together in the dark and understood, not yet what it meant, not yet the full shape of it, that something had snagged on something in a ballroom tonight and had not, despite her best efforts, come free. She would think about it tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would name it, file it, and be done with it. She almost believed that too. She knew before she entered the room. Not specifically. She didn't know the name, didn't know the title, didn't know the particular shape the morning's conversation would take. But she knew the quality of what was coming. Her father's study at 9 in the morning, with the door closed, and her mother notably absent. These three conditions together had a specific meaning in the grammar of this household. Something has been decided. Come and be told. She dressed carefully. Not slowly, she was never slow, it wasn't in her nature, but with the particular attention of someone putting on armor. The pelisse buttoned correctly, the collar straight, the small adjustments of a woman preparing for something she couldn't yet see. Her father was standing at the window when she entered, not seated, standing, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the grey October garden with the expression he wore when he had finished thinking about something and arrived at the part where he had to say it aloud. "Sit down, Eleanor." She sat. "I have arranged your marriage." She had expected this sentence at some point in her life, had known it was coming the way you knew winter was coming, inevitable, and somehow still striking when it arrived. "To whom?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Her father turned from the window and looked at her directly. "Arthur Sterling," he said, "Marquis of Blackwood." The name landed without recognition. Then the night before assembled itself in her mind. The entrance steps, the black clothes, the 3 seconds of unhurried attention, the precise inclination of a head. Her stomach dropped in a way she did not let reach her face. "I am not acquainted with him," she said. "You will be." Her father moved to his desk. "The formal announcement will be made at the end of the month. You will meet him before then." "When?" "Tomorrow." One night to prepare herself for the man she had called a gravedigger in front of half of London. "What is he like?" she asked. Her father paused, that weighted pause again. "He is direct," he said finally, "and private. He does not waste words." "Does he know about me?" "He requested you specifically." A pause. "He has refused 4 other arrangements over the past 2 years." Eleanor held very still. "Why me?" "That," her father said, with the careful tone he used when he was communicating something without saying it, "is a question you should ask him yourself." She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and turned it over and over. A man who had heard her laugh at him in public, who had looked at her for 3 seconds with those dark, unreadable eyes, who had refused 4 other women, who had, apparently, then requested her. She thought about Blackwood Manor. She had heard the name. Everyone had, in the vague way that powerful estates existed in the periphery of social consciousness. Cornwall, cliffs, a house that had been in the Sterling family for 2 centuries, a man who had inherited at 22 when his father died, and had not since then been seen in London with any regularity. She thought, why would a man who barely comes to London want a London wife? She thought, why would a man who heard me laugh at him want me specifically? She didn't sleep until well past 2. He arrived at Stratford House the following afternoon. Eleanor was in the drawing room with her mother, her embroidery untouched, her hands too aware of themselves. She heard the carriage on the front drive, heard the butler's voice, her father's footsteps, the door. She stood. The world rearranged itself very quietly. He was dressed differently today, correctly in the tailored navy of a formal call, but under the correct clothes he was still entirely himself. The same quality of presence, the same unhurried occupation of space. He looked at the room when he entered it, and then he looked at her, and for a moment she had the vertiginous sense of being recognized before the introduction. "Lady Eleanor," her father said, "may I present Arthur Sterling, Marquis of Blackwood." He looked at her with those dark, completely steady eyes. At the corner of his mouth, so small she might have imagined it, the ghost of something. Not amusement exactly. The expression of a man watching a scene arrive at the page he had been expecting. "Lady Eleanor," he said, low, unhurried. "It is a pleasure." She met his gaze and said, in the voice trained for exactly these circumstances, "Your Grace, the pleasure is mine." The words tasted like precisely what they were, and his eyes said he knew that too. She had prepared for anger. That was what she had done in the 7 days between her father's study and the first formal call, built a careful architecture of response, coldness perhaps, the kind of anger with better posture, pointed civility, possibly something more direct, a reference to Ashbourne House, words designed to make her feel small in a controlled, deniable way. She had a response ready for all of these. She had not prepared for indifference. Not the performed indifference of someone managing feelings they didn't want to show. Real indifference, or something so close to it she couldn't find the difference from the outside. The kind that arrived in the room with him the way weather arrived. Not chosen, simply present. The natural condition of a man for whom she was, apparently, a logistical matter. Blackwood House was darker than she had expected. Not unpleasant, but different from the bright, consciously decorated interiors she was accustomed to. The furniture was old and serious. The walls held portraits of people who looked as though they had never smiled, and had considered this a point of character rather than a lack. The whole house carried the feeling of a place that had been built without reference to fashion, and had remained, through the decades, entirely unbothered by that fact. He received them in the front drawing room. Standing, as she would come to understand, was simply how he existed, not performing readiness, simply ready. Tea arrived. The afternoon began. He answered her mother's questions with precision, neither curt nor excessive. He expressed an opinion about the current state of land enclosure that made Eleanor look up quickly, specific, informed, held without apology. Not the polite blandness of a man performing adequacy, an actual position. She found herself listening more carefully than she had planned. Her mother stepped out briefly, something about the tea arrangement, and the room contracted around their absence. He looked at her. "You are very composed, Lady Eleanor," he said. A quality underneath the words she couldn't locate immediately. "I have had practice," she said. "At composure?" "At being in rooms I didn't choose." She hadn't intended to say it precisely. His attention sharpened, barely visible, the way a hawk's focus sharpened before a move. "I didn't choose many rooms either," he said. Her mother returned. The conversation became weather. She turned those words over for the rest of the afternoon. In the carriage home, at dinner, into the long quiet of the evening. "I didn't choose many rooms either." What did a marquis, young, powerful, possessing more rooms than she could count, including what she had been told was an ancient manor on the Cornish cliffs, mean by that? She wrote it on a loose sheet of paper and folded it into quarters and slipped it between the pages of a book no one else in the house had ever opened. She didn't know why she kept it. Blackwood House, London, November 1814. She decided on the third call. The first two had been her mother's territory, the formal choreography of an engagement progressing through its proper stages. Eleanor had sat inside it and watched him and learned approximately nothing, which was itself a kind of information. A man who gave nothing away in drawing rooms had either nothing to give or a great deal to protect. She was increasingly certain it was the latter. On the third call, rain moving hard against the windows, her mother briefly occupied near the fireplace with correspondence, Eleanor looked at the man across from her and decided the unspoken thing between them needed to be addressed directly. She waited until her mother turned toward the window. "I owe you an apology," she said, quietly, without preamble. He looked at her. "At Ashbourne House," she said, "what I said was unkind. I want you to know I'm aware of that." She had composed this carefully. It was honest, neither excessive nor insufficient. The acknowledgement without the performance of contrition she didn't entirely feel. He set down his cup. "I don't need your apology, Lady Eleanor." She waited for the rest of the sentence. None came. "I beg your pardon?" "Your apology," he said, with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything, "is not what I need from you." The rain, her mother's pen moving. "Then what do you need?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved at the back of his eyes. Deliberate, the look of a man deciding exactly how much to give. At present, he said, your compliance. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Compliance. The heat rose somewhere under her breastbone. Not to her face, she was too controlled for that. But it was there, immediate and certain. The particular heat of a woman told, with perfect courtesy, that she was expected to behave. My compliance, she repeated. With the terms of the arrangement, he said, with the... I understand what compliance means, Your Grace. Then we have no difficulty, he said, and lifted his teacup. And the conversation closed. Her mother looked up from her correspondence. More tea, Lord Blackwood. Thank you, no, he said. I believe I have had sufficient. Eleanor looked at the window and breathed through the heat and thought, he refused my apology. Not with cruelty, with something worse, efficiency. As though her apology were a currency he had no use for. As though the whole framework she had constructed, the acknowledgement and the honesty and the dignity of admitting fault, was simply not a framework he was operating within. What did he want if not an apology? Compliance. The word sat in her chest for the rest of the afternoon, through dinner, into the long quiet of the evening. And underneath it, very quietly, a question she hadn't expected. What does it mean that he chose me after the ballroom if my apology is worth nothing to him? She didn't have an answer. She intended to find one. The answer came from his library. Fourth call. A grey Thursday. Her mother was called briefly to the entrance hall, a small domestic matter, and Eleanor was left alone in the drawing room with instructions not to move. She moved. The library door was across the hall, always slightly ajar. She had been watching it since the first call. She crossed the hall and pushed it open. The room was 2 floors high with shelves on every wall, books accumulated over generations of actual use, not arranged for appearance. Philosophy, natural history, parliamentary records, a shelf of maritime charts she hadn't expected, agricultural texts, legal volumes. The library of a man who ran a large estate seriously and read widely without needing anyone to know it. She was moving along the lower shelves when she heard him in the doorway. She turned. He stood at the entrance with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful blankness of the drawing room, something more direct. The look of a man whose space had been entered without announcement and who was deciding what to do about it. Lady Eleanor. Your Grace, she held her ground, your library is remarkable. It is not the drawing room. No, it's considerably more interesting. He crossed the room and stood near the window. She noticed he was always near windows. She was beginning to understand this was not incidental. You were looking at my shelves, he said. Yes. Why? Because rooms tell you things about people that drawing rooms don't. She held his gaze. And you don't tell me very much. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. What have my shelves told you? That you are not what you perform in that room across the hall. The November light moved across the floor between them. Somewhere below, her mother's voice in the entrance hall, returning. Why did you dress that way, Eleanor said, at Ashbourne House? He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. Because, he said, I have spent 3 years in London rooms where the only thing anyone can see is what a man wears, the cut of a coat, the height of a cravat, the precise shade of a waistcoat. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to see what was left when you removed all of that. You were testing the room. I was observing it. There is a difference. What's the difference? A test implies an expected outcome, he said. An observation implies I was simply watching. And what did you observe? He held her gaze. Below the front door, her mother's footsteps beginning on the stairs. That most people looked away, he said, or whispered. And me? A pause, precise, deliberate. You looked directly at what was there, he said, and reacted without calculation. I laughed at you, she said, in front of half the room. Yes, he said, you did. And that made you choose me. He looked at her steadily. It told me you were capable of an unguarded response, that when you saw something unexpected, you didn't manage it immediately. A beat. Most people manage everything immediately. You managed it after. Her mother's voice in the corridor. 10 seconds. That is, Eleanor said quietly, the most unusual basis for a marriage proposal I have encountered. "I imagine it is," he said. And the shadow of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite not a smile. And then her mother opened the drawing-room door and called her name, and the library became, once again, a room she was not supposed to be in. She returned across the hall. She sat. She held a teacup and thought. I looked at him and laughed, and he saw something in that laugh that I didn't know was there. She pressed her thumbnail against her finger and breathed and understood that the most important thing that had happened in this engagement so far had taken place in approximately 90 seconds, in a library she wasn't supposed to enter, in a conversation no one else had heard. After the library, something changed. Gradually. The way temperature changed in a room when a fire was lit. Not a transformation, just a slow, undeniable shift toward warmth that you noticed only after it had already happened. He still didn't perform warmth. She had stopped expecting him to, and found, to her own surprise, that she no longer needed him to. What he gave instead was presence. The specific, unusual presence of a man who, when he was in a room with you, was entirely in the room. No part of him elsewhere, no part of him performing being there, simply there, fully, without reservation, in the way she had never encountered in anyone else and had not, until she encountered it, known to want. Most people she knew were partially elsewhere most of the time. At dinners, at assemblies, in drawing rooms, she could see it in the eyes of the people she spoke to, the faint distance of someone managing the current conversation while already half preparing the next one. She had done it herself, she had perfected it even, the ability to be present enough to function while remaining safely behind the surface of the moment. With Arthur, there was no surface to remain behind. He was simply there, looking at what was actually in the room, saying what he actually thought, responding to what she actually said rather than to what she was supposed to have meant by it. It was, she was finding, the most disorienting experience of her adult life. The library became the place where things actually happened, not by arrangement. Neither of them suggested it directly, but the drawing room had its protocol and its chaperones and its managed silences, and the library operated by different rules, rules that seemed to have written themselves in the 90 seconds of her first unauthorized visit, and that neither of them had seen reason to revise. Twice more she crossed the hall when her mother was occupied with something else. Twice more he appeared, in the particular way he appeared, without announcement, without the social machinery of an entrance, simply there. And twice more they spoke in the register of people who had stopped needing to establish what they were to each other and could simply speak. "What do you read?" she asked on the second visit, "when no one is watching?" He considered the shelves. Poetry sometimes. She hadn't expected that. She had built a version of him in her mind, rigorous, dark, without ornament, a man of accounts and parliamentary records and the serious business of a large estate. Poetry did not fit this version. She was beginning to understand that her versions of people were frequently the least interesting thing about them. "Which ones?" "The ones that say things plainly," he said. "I have no patience for obscurity maintained for its own sake. Most people find directness uncomfortable. Most people are unaccustomed to being seen clearly," he said. "That is not the fault of directness." She looked at him. "Is that why you wore black to the ball? To see who could look directly at you?" "To see who would look at what was actually there," he said, "rather than at what they expected to see." She filed it, added it to the collection she hadn't decided to start, but was clearly keeping. She had begun, without making the decision consciously, to collect him. The way he tilted his head when he was finding the precise word for something, a slight leftward tilt, barely perceptible, lasting less than a second. The dry, understated humor that arrived without announcement and departed the same way, leaving her sometimes laughing a beat after the moment had passed. The maritime charts she hadn't expected on the library wall. The way he held his teacup differently in the library than in the drawing room, more loosely, without the formal correctness of the drawing room grip, as though in here he had stopped performing even the small things. She noticed when he stopped performing the small things. She noticed because she was always performing the small things, and had never met anyone who had given himself permission not to. He had strong opinions about Cornwall, about the land, the tides, the specific agriculture of cliffside estates. When he spoke about Blackwood Manor, his voice changed. Not dramatically. He was not a man who did anything dramatically. But the precision of it shifted, became something warmer. The difference between describing a property and describing a place that was part of the way you understood yourself. "What is it like?" she asked on the third library visit. "The manor, truly." He was quiet for a moment. Not the deflecting quiet, the real one. "Exposed," he said. She waited. "There is no buffer between the house and the weather, between what the land is and what you see when you look at it. In London, everything is managed. The parks, the gardens, the streets. Everything has been arranged to suggest something about itself." He looked at the window. "Blackwood is simply what it is. The cliffs are cliffs. The sea is the sea. In winter, the wind comes through the east wall in a way that 30 years of repair has never fully resolved, and the house smells of salt even when the windows are closed." A pause. "I find it easier to think there." "Easier than here?" "Easier than anywhere." She looked at him. "What do you need to think about?" A brief silence, the kind that had weight in it. "Less recently," he said. She held that sentence for a long moment. Let it be what it was, without examining it too closely. "I've never been to Cornwall," she said. "I know. What made you stay in London this long? You clearly prefer it there." He looked at the shelves. "There were things that required my presence here. The engagement, among other things." He looked at her. "But yes, primarily the engagement." She held his gaze. "You stayed in London for an engagement you didn't particularly want." "I stayed in London," he said, "for an engagement I was not yet certain I wanted. Those are different things." "And now?" He was quiet for a moment, a silence she had learned to wait through, the silence before precision. "Now," he said, "I am certain. The library, the November light." Her thumbnail pressed against her finger without her noticing. December arrived, and with it the social machinery of the Christmas season, dinners and assemblies and the ceremonial visiting that Eleanor had always found draining, and now found simply time away from the library and the conversations that were, quietly, reorganizing her understanding of what this life was going to be. She did not say this to anyone. She barely said it to herself. But the evidence was there if she looked at it directly. She had stopped rehearsing responses to his coldness. She had stopped preparing for drawing-room versions of him. She was thinking about him, instead, in the long quiet of her bedroom, at the tail end of dinners she wasn't fully present at in the carriage between one obligation and the next. The maritime charts, the poetry shelf, exposed, the barely there smile that arrived and departed before anyone could claim it, the way he had said, "I am certain," and then let the silence carry the rest. She was collecting him, and she had no plan for what to do with the collection. The fourth library visit was different. She crossed the hall on a Thursday afternoon, her mother deep in correspondence, 30 minutes she could account for, and pushed the door open, and he was already there. Not waiting for her precisely, standing at the far window with his back to the room, looking out at the December garden below. He heard her enter and turned, and something in the way he turned told her he had expected it to be her. "Lady Eleanor," he said. "You were already here," she said. "Yes." "Were you waiting?" A pause. "I was reading." "You weren't holding a book?" The ghost of something at the corner of his mouth. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She came further into the room. The December light was failing early, as it did, and the lamps had been lit, the library warmer and closer than it was in the afternoons of better light. She moved to her usual place near the lower shelves and ran her fingers along a row of spines without reading them. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know? Something that isn't about the estate or the engagement or Cornwall's agricultural conditions." She looked at him. "Something about you." He held her gaze, the complete, unhurried attention that she had stopped finding unsettling weeks ago, and now found, if she was honest, the thing she most wanted when she walked into a room. "My mother," he said after a moment, "used to read to me in this library, not children's books. She didn't believe in reading children things they would have to unlearn. She read me Donne and Milton, and occasionally, when my father was travelling, the more contentious parliamentary speeches of the previous century." Eleanor looked at him. "How old were you?" 7, 8. He looked at the shelves. "I didn't understand most of it, but I understood that she thought I was capable of it. That was what mattered. What happened to her? She died when I was 14, simply without performance of grief or the managed distance of someone who had processed it into something displayable. Just a fact, stated as facts were. She was the only person I have known who said exactly what she meant and meant exactly what she said, and saw no reason to apologize for either. The lamp on the side table, the December dark at the window, his hands at his sides. "You are looking for her," Eleanor said quietly. He looked at her sharply, the first time she had seen something close to surprise on his face. "What?" "In people," she said. "You are looking for someone who doesn't manage what they say, who reacts before they calibrate." She held his gaze. "That's why the ball, that's what the black clothes were actually for." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not the barely there shadow she had been collecting. Something more present than that. Something that reached the surface fully and stayed there for just long enough that she could see it clearly. "Yes," he said very quietly. "That is what they were for." The lamp flickered. Outside, the December wind moved through the London street, and Eleanor stood in the warm library and felt the particular sensation of having said something true that she hadn't known she understood until she said it. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your mother. It was a long time ago. That doesn't mean what I said isn't true." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She began to notice the cost of the drawing rooms in a new way after that. Not the cost to herself. She was accustomed to that, had long ago accepted it as the price of the life she was living. But the cost to him, the particular effort of a man who existed most naturally in the library register, direct, precise, genuinely present, having to reduce himself to the drawing room register, the weather and the tea and the appropriate opinions on appropriate subjects. He did it without complaint. He did everything without complaint. But she could see it now, the slight flattening of him in the formal context, the way the full quality of his attention was pulled back to something more managed, more socially legible. She started finding small ways to puncture it. Her question slightly too direct for the drawing room, asked in the tone of one, an observation that required a real response rather than a polished one. The particular pleasure she was discovering of watching him recalibrate, the almost invisible moment of decision before he answered honestly rather than correctly. "You enjoy doing that," he said once. Dry, almost entirely without inflection. "I don't know what you mean," she said, in the voice of someone who knew exactly what he meant. "You ask questions you already know the answer to," he said, "to see whether I'll give you the honest one. And do you?" "Apparently," he said, "yes." She smiled. She was getting better at smiling at him without feeling she was giving something away. The giving away no longer frightened her the way it had. At night, in the long quiet of her bedroom, she had stopped pretending she wasn't thinking about him. The mother who read Milton to a 7-year-old, the library lamp. Yes, that is what they were for. The way his voice changed when he spoke about Cornwall, the specific warmth of it, the place where he was most himself. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought, I came into this engagement certain I could manage it, learn its shape, make it workable. And then, when did I stop trying to manage it? She couldn't find the exact moment. Which meant it had happened gradually, in the accumulated weight of library conversations and dry observations, and a man who stood at windows and said things plainly and had been looking, since he was 14 years old, for someone who didn't manage everything before it reached the surface. She pressed her thumbnail against her finger and breathed. I am in considerable difficulty, she told the ceiling. The ceiling said nothing. I know, she said to herself, to the December London night pressing against the window. I know. And I find I don't particularly want to get out of it. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Her mother brought it to her directly, before breakfast, which told her everything about its urgency before she broke the seal. Carrington. She knew the name. Everyone in London knew it, in the way powerful names were known at a distance with caution. An earl with holdings across 3 counties, recently widowed, recently returned from the continent, ambitious in the particular way of men who had accumulated influence late and had no intention of stopping. She read the letter twice. The words were polite, even warm, in a surface way that made them worse. Lord Carrington presents his compliments to Lady Eleanor Vance and wishes to inform her with the greatest delicacy that certain matters pertaining to the Stratford estate have recently come to his attention. Matters which, were they to become widely known, might cast a particular light upon the current engagement arrangements. Lord Carrington is naturally disposed toward discretion and trusts that Lady Eleanor will appreciate the value of a private conversation before any unfortunate publicity. She put the letter down. Her hands were steady. She made them steady. She went to her father. He was in the study, already at his desk, which meant he had been there since early, which meant he already knew. He looked up when she entered, and his expression confirmed it. "You've seen it," he said. "Yes," she sat without being invited to. "What does he know?" Her father was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a man deciding how much truth his daughter could absorb before breakfast. "The estate," he said finally, "has not been well for some time." She held very still. "How long?" 3 years, perhaps 4. He looked at his hands. "Your mother doesn't know the full extent. I have been—" He stopped. "I have been managing it." Managing it. The phrase sat in the room with considerable weight. "And Carrington found out. Someone in my solicitor's office, or one of the creditors." Her father looked at her directly. "If this becomes public before the engagement is finalized, Blackwood will have grounds to withdraw, and the Stratford name will carry the weight of it for a generation." Eleanor looked at the window, the December street outside, grey and indifferent. She thought about Arthur, about the library and the maritime charts and Honest, about a man who had built himself in opposition to performance, who had worn black to a ballroom to find out who in the room could see past surfaces. What would he do with this? She didn't know, and the not knowing had a particular quality, not fear exactly, but the specific alertness of someone who understood that the next move mattered enormously. "I'm going to tell him," she said. Her father looked up sharply. "Eleanor, he should know, before Carrington reaches him first. We don't know that Carrington intends to go to Blackwood." "Of course he does," she said. "That's the entire strategy. He goes to Blackwood with this and offers to suppress it in exchange for some arrangement. The engagement is the leverage." She stood. "Arthur needs to know before that conversation happens." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You called him Arthur," he said. She picked up her gloves from the chair beside her. "I'll be back before dinner." She arrived at Blackwood House without her mother and without sending a card ahead. The butler received her with the careful neutrality of someone trained never to register surprise, and showed her to the entrance hall. She waited. The house was quiet around her in its particular way. The portraits on the walls, the dark old wood, the quality of a place that had been here long before anyone currently living in it, and would be here long after. He came down the stairs with unhurried steps, and looked at her standing in his entrance hall without a chaperone, and said nothing about it. "Lady Eleanor." "Your Grace." She held his gaze. "I have something you need to know." He took her to the library. She told him everything. The letter, the debts, her father's 4 years of managed silence, Carrington's strategy. She told him clearly and without softening it, watching his face as she spoke. Nothing moving in his expression, the surface holding completely, but a small tightening around his eyes that she had learned to read. When she finished, he was quiet. "How long have you had the letter?" "Since this morning." "You came directly." "I came as soon as I understood what it was." He moved to the window. The December garden below, bare and grey and honest, the way he had described the manor. She waited. "My father spent 30 years building influence in the north," he said after a moment. "Carrington tried to buy into that network 2 years ago. I refused him." A pause. "He has been looking for a different instrument since then." "My family is the instrument," she said. "Your family's difficulty is the instrument," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him. "Can he damage us?" He turned from the window. "No," he said. "One word. Direct and complete." She stared at him. "You sound very certain." "I am certain." "Why?" A pause. He held her gaze with the particular steadiness she had spent 3 months learning to receive without looking away from. "Because," he said, I became aware of Carrington's interest in your father's estate 10 days ago. 10 days ago. 12 days before the letter arrived on her breakfast table. Before she had gone to her own father. Before any of this had reached the surface she could see. What did you do? She asked. I had conversations, he said, with Carrington's primary creditors, with the man in your father's solicitor's office who had been speaking out of turn, with 2 members of a committee Carrington requires for a land arrangement in Yorkshire. He looked at her steadily. Carrington sent you that letter this morning because it was the last instrument he had. It will be the last. Eleanor's hands were still at her sides. You knew about my father's debts, she said slowly. Yes, before the engagement. Yes, and you said nothing. No. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. The library around them, the December light failing at the windows, his face, the careful composure of it, and underneath, closer to the surface than she had ever seen, something that had no performance in it at all. Because it was not relevant to my decision, he said. Her breath left her slowly. The debts of my family were not relevant to your decision to marry me. No? That, she said carefully, is not how most men in your position would approach this. No, he agreed. It is not. Why did you protect them? She asked. My family, secretly, before I even knew there was something to protect. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, the most unguarded she had ever seen him, the careful architecture with something genuinely present beneath it, close enough to the surface that she could see it clearly for the first time. Because, he said quietly, you are under my protection now. Your family is under my protection. That is not conditional on your awareness of it. The words arrived in the room and stayed there. Not the cold compliance of the drawing room, not the refused apology, not the efficiency, not the managed distance of 3 months of formal calls. This, direct, certain, carrying the full weight of a man who had decided something and acted on it without requiring acknowledgement. You handled it without telling me, she said. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because, he said, I didn't want you to feel that I had acted on your behalf in a way that diminished you, or that I was extending protection as a form of ownership. A pause. It is not ownership. It is simply what I do for people I have chosen. Eleanor looked at him. She had come here today to warn him, to bring him information. The way she had decided she would bring him things, directly, without management, without performance. She had come to be useful and honest, and to let him decide what to do with what she gave him. She had arrived to find he had already decided, had already moved, had done it quietly, completely, 10 days ago, without once making her feel it was something she needed to thank him for. I said I needed your compliance, he said, on that first call. She waited. I was wrong, he said, the word in the room, chosen deliberately by a man who chose everything deliberately. That is the first apology you've offered me, she said. Yes. You refused mine. I did. Why? Because your apology was for the laugh, he said, and the laugh was not the problem. What was the problem? That after the laugh, he said, you managed everything. Every call, every drawing room, every correct response, all performance. He looked at her directly. I didn't want the performance. I had already seen what was underneath it. And now, she said. Now, he said, you are standing in my entrance hall without a chaperone, with a letter you drove across London to bring me, because you decided I needed the information, and you didn't wait for the appropriate channels. Yes. That, he said, is not management. She held his gaze, her thumbnail pressed against her finger, the December dark gathering at the windows. No, she said, it isn't. The library was completely quiet around them. The house, the London street outside, indifferent. Eleanor, he said, her name without the title, for the first time. She held it, held the sound of it, the way he said it, the specific quality of a word chosen carefully by a man who chose everything carefully. Thank you, she said, for what you did, for my family. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said. I want to. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, Barely, the corner of his mouth. The shadow of something that came and went before it could be claimed. "Go home, Lady Eleanor," he said, "before your mother sends a search party." She went. In the carriage, the London dark pressing against the windows, she sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart doing something she had no immediate plans to examine closely. She had arrived to warn him. She had found, instead, that he had already been standing between her and the danger for 10 days, silently, without requiring her gratitude or her awareness. She pressed her face briefly toward the cold window and breathed. That, she thought, is not the man I laughed at in that ballroom. And then, more quietly, it is exactly that man, I just couldn't see it yet. They were married on a Saturday, not in London, at a chapel in Cornwall, small and old and smelling of salt and stone, with the January sea audible even inside, present in everything, the low continuous sound of it, as though Blackwood Manor and everything belonging to it existed in permanent conversation with the water below. Eleanor stood beside Arthur in the pale winter light and said the words and felt them change the shape of things. His hand around hers was warm. That was what she noticed first. The warmth of it, steady, deliberate, the same quality of care she had first seen in a library in London, a conversation no one else had heard. Blackwood Manor was everything she had imagined, and nothing like it. She had expected grandeur, the aggressive kind, the kind that announced itself and required acknowledgement. What she found instead was something older and more serious. The house sat on the cliff edge, as though it had grown there. Stone the colour of charcoal in winter light, windows looking out over a drop to the sea that made her catch her breath the first time she stood at the glass. The sound was constant, not unpleasant. Once she had adjusted to it, she couldn't imagine the house without it. The sea was always there, in the walls and the floors and the salt in the air, a presence as permanent and unbothered as the man who had been born in this house and shaped, in part, by its particular honesty. Honest, she thought, standing at the window on the first morning. He said the house was honest. She understood it now. He showed her the house himself. Not the formal tour, just the two of them moving through the rooms in the grey January light, his hand briefly touching door frames, pausing at windows, naming things not because he felt required to, but because he wanted her to see them. He showed her the library last, larger than the London one, older. The shelves going floor to ceiling on 3 walls, a reading corner near the fireplace worn into perfect comfort over decades of use, and at the far end, a window that looked out directly onto the sea. She walked to it and stood there and looked out at the grey January water and felt something settle in her that she hadn't known was unsettled. "I will live at this window," she said. "I thought you might," he said, and she heard without turning the quiet particular pleasure of it. On the 3rd evening they sat in the smaller sitting room, the one that felt like the house actually breathed, and the fire was high, and the sea was audible outside, and she looked at him across the width of the room and said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it." "At Ashbourne House, when I laughed." She held his gaze. "What did you actually feel?" He was quiet for a moment, the real quiet, the one where he was finding the exact words. "Interested," he said. She stared at him. "Interested. You were the only person in that room who looked at something unexpected and responded honestly." A pause. "Everyone else managed it. You didn't manage it until after. The laugh came first. The laugh was unkind. The laugh was unguarded," he said. "There is a difference. You keep making that distinction, because it is the only distinction that matters to me. The fire, the sea outside, the old house holding them both. I spent months being angry at you," she said. "After the study, after the first call, after compliance. I know." "You knew and said nothing." "I was waiting for the anger to run out," he said. "Anger was a performance. I wasn't interested in the performance." "When did it run out?" He looked at the fire. "The library, the first visit. When you told me that rooms told you things about people that drawing rooms didn't." He looked at her. "You weren't performing then. You were simply telling the truth." "I was trespassing," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "That too." She had thought it would be him, through all of it. The The cold drawing rooms and the refused apology and the library visits and the December carriage and the slow, undeniable weight of him. She had assumed that when the distance between them finally closed, it would be him who closed it. He had chosen her, after all. He had worn black to a ballroom and stood there and observed and selected her from 200 people. Surely the last move was his. But he had given her the library. He had given her the conversations about poetry and Cornwall and honesty. He had given her December, 10 days of silent protection. You are under my protection now. The most complete thing anyone had ever communicated to her by doing rather than saying. He had given her everything except the last step, and she had understood, sitting at that window, looking at the January sea, that the last step was hers. Not because he was withholding it, because he was waiting, genuinely, patiently, with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned never to take what hadn't been freely offered, to see whether she would choose it. He had chosen her in a ballroom. It was her turn to choose him in a sitting room. She rose from her chair. She crossed the room, not quickly, not with the braced quality of someone managing something difficult, but simply and directly, the way she moved when she had decided where she was going, and sat beside him on the settee rather than across from him. Close enough that her sleeve touched his arm, he went still, not the composed still, a different kind. "Eleanor," he said, low, almost only for the room. "I am not," she said, "performing this." He turned to look at her, close now, close enough that she could see everything she had been learning to read for 3 months, everything he kept behind the composure, all of it near the surface, the careful attention, the warmth that never performed itself, the particular quality of a man who was, for the first time in her experience of him, not entirely in control of his own expression. "I know," he said. She leaned forward slowly, the way she had learned to do things with him, without hurry, without performance, with the full attention of someone who had stopped managing the moment and started living it. He met her, not with the careful correctness of an expected thing, not with the managed distance of drawing rooms and protocol, warm and certain and entirely present, the way he was present in everything, fully, once he had decided something deserved his full presence. She had been apparently worth his full presence. From a ballroom in October, across 3 months of black clothes and libraries, and refused apologies and December carriages, to here, a sitting room on a cliff in Cornwall with the sea outside and the fire burning low and the long honest life of Blackwood Manor beginning to settle around them both. Later, much later, the fire reduced to embers, the sea audible through the walls in the particular way it was audible on still nights. She sat beside him in the quiet that was, by now, the most familiar sound she knew. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Without looking up from the book, he was not, she noticed, actually reading. "About Ashbourne House," she said. "Still, about how wrong I was." He set the book down. "You were wrong about the clothes," he said. "You were right about everything else." She turned to look at him. "What else was I right about?" "That I was severe," he said, "and ungraceful, and the kind of man who turns up to a party dressed for a funeral and sees nothing wrong with it." She laughed, the real one, unguarded, arriving before caution, and he watched it with the expression she had been collecting since the library, the one that went all the way in, the one that was entirely his and entirely for her. "You are," she said when it had settled, "the most unexpected person I have ever met." "You are," he said, "the only person who has ever surprised me." The embers, the sea, the old house on the cliffs holding them both in its honest dark. She leaned her shoulder against his and looked at the fire and felt the particular quality of a life that had not gone the way she planned and had gone instead exactly right. She had called him a crow. He had chosen her for it. And she, who had spent 20 years learning to be exactly what she was supposed to be, had walked out of a ballroom into something none of her preparation had prepared her for. Something real. She closed her eyes and listened to the sea. His hand found hers in the dark. That, she thought, is how it happened, not with grand gestures or performed declarations, with black clothes, with a laugh, with the slow, stubborn, inconvenient discovery that the man she had dismissed in 3 seconds was going to take the rest of her life to fully understand, and that she was, standing on the edge of the Cornish cliffs with the sea and the walls of the house around her, entirely glad of it.
I laughed at you that night, golden lights, a crowded room. Everything felt so easy, playing the role I was meant to assume. You stood there by the doorway, like you had nothing to prove. And I thought I understood it all, but I had no idea what you do. Then you turned and looked at me, no anger, no defense, just something in your silence that didn't make any sense. It was only 3 seconds, but it changed everything. A quiet kind of presence, like a truth I couldn't outrun within. I tried to forget you, but you stayed right there in me, between who I was and who I was starting to be. They say time reveals things, but you never had to speak. Every silence between us said more than words could read. You didn't want forgiveness, you didn't need apology. You only wanted something real, hidden underneath me. And I, who always knew the rules, didn't know what to do when you saw right through the mask before I even knew. It was only 3 seconds, but it changed everything. Your calm cut deeper than any careless thing. I tried to move on, but you stayed with me, between every word I said and what I couldn't be. And when the world fell quiet, you were already there, holding everything I feared, like you actually cared. You never asked for anything, never tried to control. You just stood beside the truth, and it reached into my soul. It was only 3 seconds, but it became my whole life. From a careless moment to something I can't deny. And now I see it clearly, what I couldn't see then. You didn't change my world, you just showed me who I am. I laughed at you, and you stayed. And somewhere in the silence, I stopped running away.